Andes Cordillera runs the length of South America like a spine made of stone and ice. In early October, the southern hemisphere spring has not yet loosened winter's hold on the high peaks. Snow lies deep in the valleys. The air is thin. The silence is total. At 4,000 meters, the mountains are indifferent to the presence of life. They do not welcome it. They do not reject it. They simply exist, vast and cold, and anything that enters them must reckon with that cold. On the afternoon of October 13th, 1972, a twin-engine Fairchild turboprop departed from Mendoza, Argentina, carrying 45 people towards Santiago, Chile. The passengers were members of a Uruguayan rugby team, Old Christians Club, along with friends, family and crew. The flight had originated in Montevideo. Weather, over the Andes, forced a stop in Mendoza. When conditions appeared to improve, the crew decided to continue. The route required crossing the Cordillera at a low altitude because the aircraft could not climb higher. Visibility was poor. Cloud cover obscured the peaks. The co-pilot flying the plane believed they had crossed the mountains and began descent towards Santiago. They had not. They were still deep inside the range, surrounded by summits they could not see. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, the right wing clipped a peak. The wing sheared off. Seconds later, the tail section broke away, taking several passengers with it into open air. The fuselage, now a cylinder of torn metal, struck a snow-covered slope and tobogganed downward at high speed before coming to rest in a narrow valley between mountains. 12 people died on impact, or within hours. The remaining 33 were alive, injured, and stranded at an elevation later estimated near 3,600 meters. There was no radio that functioned. There were no inhabitants within walking distance. The nearest sign of civilization lay more than 80 kilometers west, across glaciers and ridges that required mountaineering skill and equipment they did not possess. Most of the survivors were young men between 18 and 26 years old. A few were older, 2 were women, several had broken legs, others had internal injuries or skull fractures. One boy, a medical student named Roberto Canessa, attempted to treat wounds with no instruments and almost no medical supplies. Another, Gustavo Zerbino, also a medical student, assisted. The fuselage offered shelter from wind but not from cold. At night, temperatures dropped well below freezing. They huddled together for warmth. The metal walls conducted cold inward. Snow surrounded the wreckage on all sides. They had little food, a few bottles of wine, some chocolates, a small amount of snacks passengers had carried. The cargo hold contained nothing useful. Within 2 days it became clear that rescue was not imminent. On the third day, they heard a radio broadcast, salvaged from wreckage, that announced the search had been called off. The authorities in Santiago believed no one could have survived. The mountains, they concluded, had taken everyone. The group began to ration what food remained. Each person received a small piece of chocolate, a capful of wine. It was not enough. Hunger arrived quickly, within a week. And the feeling of hunger became constant. Conversations turned to food, to meals remembered, to restaurants in Montevideo. Some prayed, some tried to remain practical. Fernando Parrado, whose mother and sister had died in the crash, spoke little. He lay injured for days, skull fractured, but he did not die. Slowly he recovered enough to move. The sun was strong during the day. It reflected off the snow and burned exposed skin. The brightness was painful. At night, the cold returned. The routine was to wake, melt snow for water, wait, sleep. They did not yet know how long this would last. Optimism persisted in some. Others understood more quickly that hope, by itself, solved nothing. By the end of the first week, starvation had begun to alter bodies. Muscle weakened, thought slowed, the injured healed poorly. It became clear that without food, all of them would die, regardless of rescue. The question was not whether they would starve, but when. Someone raised the possibility. It was not spoken aloud at first. It was discussed quietly between 2 or 3 people. The dead lay outside in the snow, preserved by cold. The bodies were those of friends, teammates, family. The discussion was not casual. It was not easy. Religious objections were raised, moral boundaries were named, but the fact remained that they were dying, and the dead were not. On the 10th day, a small group made the decision. They did not announce it to everyone at once. They cut small pieces of flesh from a body that had been a companion days earlier. They did not cook it. There was no fuel. They ate it frozen. The taste was unfamiliar. The act was unfamiliar. Some could not do it. Some forced themselves. No one celebrated. There was no justification offered in the moment, only the arithmetic of survival. Over the following days, the practice became routine, not easier, but routine. Those who could not participate at first eventually did. The alternative was clear. Starvation does not negotiate. The group developed methods. Certain individuals took responsibility for cutting, others for distribution. It was organized quietly, without ceremony. The dead were treated with as much dignity as the act allowed. They removed clothing first. They did not desecrate faces. They worked quickly and in silence. This continued for weeks. On October 29th, 16 days after the crash, an avalanche struck the fuselage during the night. Snow poured through openings in the wreckage and filled the interior within seconds. 8 more people died, suffocated under the weight of snow before they could dig themselves free. The survivors clawed their way out. The fuselage was now half buried. Space inside shrank. The cold worsened. The group, now 27, understood that waiting passively would kill them all. 3 men, Parado, Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin, began to prepare for an attempt to walk out. They did not know the distance. They did not have maps. They had no climbing equipment, no crampons, no rope suitable for glaciers. They fashioned crude snowshoes from seat cushions. They sewed a sleeping bag from fabric. They gathered what scraps of food they could carry. The plan was to climb west toward Chile and find help. The rest would wait. The first attempt, in early November, failed after 1 day. The altitude and cold were too severe. They returned. They rested. They prepared again. On December 12th, 60 days after the crash, Parado, Canessa, and Vizintin set out again. This time they did not turn back. They climbed a peak to the west, believing Chile lay just beyond. From the summit, they saw only more mountains, range after range, no end visible. Vizintin, weakened, returned to the fuselage. Parado and Canessa continued alone. They walked for 9 days. They crossed glaciers. They descended rocky slopes. They slept in the open, pressed together, in the sleeping bag. They had no tent. The nights were brutal. During the day the sun burned their faces raw. Their lips split. Their legs cramped. They moved slowly, each step deliberate. They did not speak much. There was nothing to say. They carried strips of frozen flesh in a rugby sock. They rationed it carefully. On the 9th day, December 21st, they descended into a valley and saw greenery. Trees, grass, the first signs of life they had seen in more than 2 months. They followed a river downstream. In the distance they saw a man on horseback on the opposite bank. They shouted. The man saw them, but the river was too loud. He returned the next day with others. A note was thrown across the water, tied to a stone. Parado wrote a message explaining who they were and where the others waited. The horsemen rode for help. 2 days later, on December 23rd, helicopters reached the crash site. 16 people were still alive. They were emaciated, frostbitten, exhausted. They were flown out in 2 groups due to altitude and weather constraints. The last of them left the mountains on December 23rd, 72 days after the crash. The world learned what they had done to survive. The revelation was immediate and public. Some condemned them, some defended them. Religious authorities were consulted. The survivors did not apologize. They did not boast. They described what happened with little embellishment. They explained that they had prayed before eating. They said they believed their friends, now dead, would have wanted them to live. Whether that was true or a narrative constructed afterward is uncertain. What is certain is that without that decision, none of them would have survived. The 16 who lived did not emerge unchanged. Several suffered long-term psychological effects. Some struggled with guilt. Others found meaning in the experience. As Parado later said, he felt no guilt, only gratitude that he had lived. Canessa became a pediatric cardiologist. Others returned to ordinary lives. A few wrote books. A film was made. The story entered public memory, examined and re-examined, stripped for meaning. And what remains beyond interpretation is the fact of 16 people walking out of mountains that should have killed them. They did not do so through heroism in the conventional sense. They did so through endurance, collaboration, and a willingness to cross a boundary most human societies forbid. That boundary was not crossed lightly. It was crossed because the alternative was extinction. Whether that makes the act moral, immoral, or simply necessary is a question each observer must answer for themselves. The Andes did not judge them. The mountains remained indifferent. The snow melted in spring. The wreckage was eventually removed. The site is unmarked. What happened there is remembered not because it was extraordinary in the sense of triumph, but because it was extraordinary in the sense of extremity. It revealed the edge of what human beings are capable of when all other options are gone. Survival, in the end, is not a virtue. It is a fact. 16 people survived because they chose to live, and they accepted the cost of that choice. The dead made survival possible, not through intention, but through the accident of their bodies remaining behind. The survivors carried that knowledge forward. They carried it quietly, without fanfare, for the rest of their lives. The story is not one of victory. It is one of endurance, past the point where endurance should be possible. It is a story of hunger, cold, fear, and the slow realization that the rules governing normal life do not apply when normal life has ended. It is a story of 16 people who lived because they were willing to do what was necessary, and who lived afterward with the knowledge of what necessity had required. The mountains remain, the snow still falls in winter, the silence is still total. And somewhere in the memory of those who were there or who heard the story is the understanding that survival is not always a matter of strength or skill. Sometimes it is only a matter of willingness. Willingness to continue when continuation seems impossible. Willingness to make choices that cannot be unmade. Willingness to carry the weight of those choices long after the immediate danger has passed. 16 lived, 29 did not. The difference between those numbers is not heroism, it is not fate. It is a series of decisions made in the cold, in the hunger, in the dark, when the only alternative to acting was dying. The survivors did not ask to be tested. They did not seek the mountains. They were placed there by accident, by weather, by a navigational error, by the simple fact of being on a plane that struck a mountain on a cloudy afternoon in October. What they did in response is now part of history. It is studied in ethics courses, or it is debated in religious contexts. It is referenced in discussions of survival psychology. But for the 16 who lived, it is not an abstraction. It is a memory of cold metal, of thin air, of faces they knew, of a decision that allowed them to walk out of the snow and return to a world that had already mourned them. They returned and they continued living. That is the end of the story, not redemption, not transformation, just continuation. They survived, and they went home, and they carried with them the knowledge that survival, at its most extreme, requires crossing lines that should not exist, and that sometimes in the space between life and death, those lines become invisible, not because they are unimportant, but because they are the only path forward. The Andes remain indifferent. The story remains factual. 16 lived. That is what happened.